Dawn over the savannah. A silhouette slowly emerges from the mist. Almost a ton of muscle and horns. An African buffalo. One of the continent's most dangerous beasts. An animal capable of trampling a lion without even realizing it. But now he stands motionless, allowing the tiny creature to crawl right into his ear. This isn't a tormenting parasite. It's an oxpecker. A bird slightly larger than a sparrow, with a bright red beak and tenacious claws. It will literally spend its entire life on the back of a buffalo. Did you know that this tiny bird can spot a lion in the tall grass before the buffalo itself? In this episode, you'll learn what an oxpecker is, why these giant animals tolerate it right in their ears and nostrils, and whether it's true that this bird is a loyal protector of the buffalo. Like and subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. The red-billed oxpecker is a member of the passerine order, native to the savannas and woodlands of East and South Africa. It belongs to the family Buffagidae, a small group of birds so distinct from all other birds that scientists have long been unable to determine where it belongs. Oxpeckers were once considered relatives of starlings. Today, biologists increasingly recognize them as a distinct, very ancient branch of the avian genus. The oxpecker's appearance is unremarkable. A brown back, a slightly yellowish belly, and a short tail. But there's one detail that's impossible to miss. Its bright red beak. Sharp and slightly flattened on the sides, as if designed specifically for a single purpose. And this job is to live on the body of another animal. The oxpecker almost never lands on the ground. It eats, sleeps, grooms its feathers, and searches for a mate, all while perched on the back, sides, or neck of a large herbivore. Its favorite hosts are buffalo, rhinoceroses, giraffes, zebras, hippos, antelopes, and even livestock. Its short but very strong legs, with sharp, curved claws, help it maintain its grip on the sloping skin, which constantly trembles to ward off flies. With these, the oxpecker clings to almost any surface, like a woodpecker clings to a tree trunk. Its tail, stiff and springy, provides additional support. The bird seems to lean on it when climbing up the side of a buffalo or hanging upside down on its neck. For a buffalo, such a neighbor is common. A single large male can have several oxpeckers nesting on him at once, some working at the base of his horns, some in the folds of skin on his neck, and still others nesting right in his ear. And the buffalo, an animal ready to take down any predator with a single blow of its horns, stands patiently waiting for the tiny bird to finish its work. What kind of work is this? The oxpecker's main food is parasites that cling to the skin of large herbivores, primarily ticks. Buffalo hide, especially during the hot season, becomes a veritable feeding ground for these bloodsuckers. They burrow into the folds of the skin, into the ears, under the tail, where the buffalo itself simply can't reach with its tongue or horns. And this is where the oxpecker comes into the picture. A single adult bird can peck at around 100 blood-fed ticks in a single day. Or, if you count the larvae, over 12,000 tiny parasites. For comparison, that's roughly the same number of insects as would be found in a handful of soil somewhere in the savannah after a rain. The bird works methodically, literally combing every available centimeter of skin with its beak, like a tiny comb on legs. In addition to ticks, the oxpecker's diet includes fly larvae, lice, fleas, and other small insects that disturb the buffalo's hide. Sometimes the birds even catch ordinary flying insects out of the air, soaring from their host's back and immediately returning, like a fighter jet taking off from the deck of an aircraft carrier. Scientists studying the behavior of oxpeckers note that the birds prefer ticks that have already fed on blood and are bloated. They are larger, more nutritious, and easier to spot and peck. Hungry flat ticks are much smaller and less attractive to birds. This may seem like a minor detail, but it will later become the key to one of the most controversial mysteries in the biology of this symbiosis. We'll return to it a little later. In the meantime, here is another habit of the oxpecker that makes it an indispensable neighbor of the buffalo. The buffalo is a cautious animal, but its eyesight leaves much to be desired. It's much better at smelling and hearing than detecting movement in tall grass. And here's where the little passenger comes in handy again. The oxpecker sits high up, on the buffalo's back or neck, meaning it has a much wider and wider view of the savanna than its owner. Should the bird spot suspicious movement in the bushes, a prowling lion, cheetah, or human, it emits a sharp, rattling alarm call and begins thrashing frantically along the animal's back. For the buffalo, this is a signal. Something is wrong, and it needs to be on guard. Scientists speculate that this is precisely why large herbivores are so indifferent to the presence of oxpeckers near their most vulnerable body parts, the eyes, ears, and nostrils. After all, the bird perched right next to their ear is the first to notice a rustle in the grass and raise the alarm. A similar alarm system has been described for another African giant, the rhinoceros. According to a study from 2020, black rhinoceroses with oxpeckers nearby noticed approaching humans 4 times more often than rhinoceroses without the bird guardians. The rhinoceros, whose eyesight is even weaker than that of a buffalo, literally relies on the small feathered sentinel to detect danger in time. A similar mechanism likely operates with buffalo. The sensitive bird on the back of the neck becomes part of the entire herd's survival system. It would seem like the perfect friendship story. The giant gets clear skin and early warning of danger. The baby gets nutritious food and a safe place to live. Mutual benefit, symbiosis at its most beautiful. But the more closely scientists observed oxpeckers, the more questions they had. It turned out that ticks are far from the only thing this bird eats, and its second predilection is far more difficult to describe as harmless preening. This addiction can turn everything you just learned about the friendship between the buffalo and the oxpecker upside down. Just a few decades ago, biologists were almost certain that the oxpecker and its large host were a classic example of a mutually beneficial partnership. The bird cleans its skin of parasites. The animal tolerates its companionship. A simple, beautiful formula, eagerly repeated in all books on nature. But then the researchers began to take a closer look, not just observing from the sidelines, but studying exactly what the oxpecker was doing with its beak on the buffalo's body, minute by minute. And the picture turned out to be much more complex. It turns out that the oxpecker often flies not to healthy skin, but directly to an open wound, an old scratch, a fresh abrasion from a rival's horns, or a bite from another animal. The bird lands nearby and begins pecking at the edges of the wound, preventing it from healing. Sometimes it does this for a long time, literally preventing the wound from healing. And in some cases, the oxpecker is capable of tearing a thin, already dried scab with its beak and reopening the wound, simply to get to the blood. Blood turned out to be a much more desirable delicacy for the oxpecker than previously believed. It also explains another of the bird's habits, crawling into the buffalo's ears and nostrils, not only for ticks, but also for earwax, mucus, and dried secretions. Nutritious, but, to put it mildly, not the most pleasant food. It's a strange picture. The bird, which for centuries has been called the doctor of the savanna, is capable of creating the very wounds it then lovingly heals. To figure out whether the oxpecker really is a helper or an uninvited guest, scientists conducted a series of observations in the wild and experiments with animal models. One line of research was simple and illustrative. Biologists compared the number of ticks on the bodies of large ungulates, which were constantly surrounded by oxpeckers, with those on animals rarely approached by the birds. The logic was obvious. If the oxpecker was truly a sanitary animal, then its charges should have significantly fewer ticks. The result surprised even the researchers themselves. They found no statistically significant correlation between the presence of oxpeckers and a reduction in the number of parasites on the host's body. Simply put, animals constantly fussed over by birds were not significantly cleaner than those rarely visited by oxpeckers. How is this possible if a bird can eat about 100 ticks in one day? The answer, apparently, lies in the very detail discussed in the first chapter. The oxpecker prefers large, blood-fed ticks, those that will soon fall off the host and lay eggs. But the bird pecks at the small, newly attached ticks, which pose the main threat. They carry infections and cause inflammation, far less often. It appears that the oxpecker prioritizes its own diet, choosing the most nutritious prey, rather than the buffalo's health. Another line of research involves studying the stomach contents of oxpeckers captured in the wild for banding. Scientists have found not only tick fragments, but also traces of the host's blood, skin particles, and hair. This confirms that feeding on blood and damaged tissue is not a rare occurrence or a mistake by individual birds, but a completely normal, widespread part of the species' diet. Some observations also concerned the behavior of buffalo, zebras, and other large animals. Sometimes the animals visibly flinch or swat away at oxpecker with their tails, precisely when a bird pecks an open wound, not when it's picking ticks from a smooth patch of skin. This appears to be a clear sign of irritation or even pain, a reaction difficult to confuse with grateful composure. Of course, it would be wrong to call the oxpecker a mere parasite, like a tick or leech. It does, however, consume a huge number of harmful insects that would otherwise continue sucking their host's blood for weeks. It does indeed raise the alarm at the sight of a predator or a human, and large herbivores clearly don't perceive it as a threat. Otherwise, they would have chased the birds away long ago. Fortunately, a buffalo or rhinoceros would have more than enough strength for that. But it also seems impossible to call this alliance pure, unadulterated mutualism, a mutually beneficial partnership where both parties benefit. Rather, it's something in between. The oxpecker uses the buffalo as a source of food and safe shelter, occasionally providing real benefits, and occasionally causing quite significant harm. Some researchers even suggest that the balance of these relationships may change depending on the season, the animal's age, and the condition of its skin. During the dry season, when ticks are particularly abundant on the buffalo's body, the oxpecker likely does more good than harm. It simply doesn't have time to switch to blood when easy prey in the form of parasites is abundant. However, during calmer periods, when ticks are fewer, the bird may more often turn to wounds as a reserve food source. This is just a guess, and it requires further study. Scientists cannot yet say with certainty how exactly this balance shifts throughout the year. It turns out that the question we posed at the beginning, hero or intruder, has no simple answer. And perhaps the question itself is misphrased. After all, the buffalo, apparently, doesn't choose between friend and foe. It simply tolerates the bird, which sometimes cleans its skin and sometimes injures it, because, overall, coexistence with the oxpecker is still more beneficial than without it. But if this is true, then an even more intriguing question arises. What allows a buffalo, an animal capable of killing a lion with a single blow of its horns, to tolerate a creature that occasionally inflicts pain on its body? Why doesn't it shed the drag gobbler with a single swipe of its hide, trample it, or flee from the annoying visitor? The answer to this question is far more complex than it first appears, and it is precisely this that we will approach in the final part of this story. The answer to the question posed at the end of the last chapter begins with a simple observation. A buffalo is actually quite capable of getting rid of a pesky neighbor if it so chooses. It can give a sharp jerk of its skin. Large ungulates have specialized subcutaneous muscles that allow it to shake the skin almost anywhere on the body, warding off flies and horseflies. It can scratch itself against a tree or a rock. Ultimately, it can simply move away. But according to researchers' observations, buffalo almost never do any of these things specifically for the oxpecker. In fact, there's ample evidence to the contrary. The animals seem to adapt to the bird's behavior. Buffalo have been observed slightly tilting their heads or turning their ears, as if facilitating the oxpecker's access to a hard-to-reach spot. Similar behavior has been described in other hosts, giraffes, zebras, and antelopes, who freeze in place or adopt characteristic poses while the bird works on their necks or near their eyes. Scientists theorize that this is simply a matter of weighing costs and benefits, inherent in evolution as a whole. Driving away an oxpecker means expending energy and possibly losing the benefits the bird does provide, removal of some ticks, and early warning at the sight of a predator. Enduring periodic pricks from a bird's beak in the wound area is not the most pleasant, but a tolerable price. For an animal weighing nearly a ton and covered in thick skin, a prick from a bird's beak is hardly comparable in pain to a horsefly bite or a wasp sting, which a buffalo already endures dozens of times a day without so much as flinching. However, regular tick removal and timely warning of danger are a far more compelling argument in favor of simply tolerating the presence of an oxpecker. In other words, for the buffalo, this isn't apparently a story about trust or affection in the human sense. Rather, it's a long-standing, millennia-honed compromise, tolerating minor inconvenience for the sake of tangible gain. Nature rarely builds its alliances on pure sympathy. Far more often, it's based on precisely this cold calculation, where each side gets something for itself, sometimes without considering the interests of the other. It's difficult to say exactly how long this story of a bird perched on the body of a giant lasted. Fossil remains of oxpeckers themselves are poorly preserved. Small bird bones rarely survive to this day in a form suitable for study. But according to molecular studies, the Buffagidae family, to which the oxpecker belongs, represents a very ancient, distinct branch of the avian genus, diverging from its closest relatives, starlings and mockingbirds, long before the emergence of modern humans. This means that long before the first humans began domesticating livestock and sedentary farming, oxpeckers were already perched on the backs of wild buffalo, antelope, and rhinoceroses, pecking at ticks and occasionally irritating their wounds. Their alliance with large herbivores developed over centuries or even millennia. It is the result of a much longer, gradual process of mutual adaptation. Interestingly, with the arrival of humans and domesticated livestock, oxpeckers quickly adapted to new hosts. Today, the birds are often found on the backs of cows and other livestock in areas of Africa where wild oxpecker populations live. However, farmers have mixed feelings about them. Some consider oxpeckers useful helpers, ridding their livestock of ticks, while others, on the contrary, complain that the birds aggravate the animals' wounds and impede their healing. Both opinions, as we have already seen, have a basis in fact. There's another detail that helps explain why the oxpecker behaves the way it does. Its bright red beak isn't just a decoration. It's designed to cope equally well with two very different tasks: carefully plucking tiny ticks from thick fur while being sharp enough to break open dried scabs on a wound. It's a kind of compromise tool that reflects the bird's dual nature. It hasn't specialized exclusively on parasites, as some heron species have, for example, which prefer to catch insects disturbed by grazing animals, but leave the animals alone. The oxpecker has taken a different evolutionary path, one of much closer physical contact with its host's body, and this path has brought both clear benefits and certain costs to the hosts. Because of this characteristic, scientists still debate how to properly classify the relationship between the oxpecker and large herbivores. Some researchers prefer the term conditional mutualism, an alliance that is beneficial only under certain conditions, such as during tick season. Others speak of commensalism, with a tendency toward parasitism. That is, a relationship in which the bird clearly wins almost always, while the host only occasionally does. There is no consensus in the scientific community yet, and this, perhaps, most honestly reflects the very essence of such natural alliances. They rarely fit into the neat, unambiguous definitions so beloved of textbooks. The question of who wins more, the buffalo or the oxpecker, may seem like nothing more than a humorous detail about life on the African savanna. But in fact, such stories help us understand something far more important: how nature truly works. For a long time, popular culture has ingrained the idea that the wild world is divided into clear categories: predator and prey, friend and foe, helper and parasite. The reality, however, is far more complex and far more interesting. Most alliances between species are neither strong friendships nor outright hostility, but a fluid equilibrium that can shift in one direction or another depending on the season, the condition of the individual, the availability of other food, and dozens of other factors we may not even have had time to study. The oxpecker and the buffalo are a perfect example. Watching them from afar, it's easy to be touched. A small bird lovingly tends to a huge beast, and in gratitude, the beast allows it to live on its back. But look closer, and the picture becomes more complex. The bird pursues its own interests, with no regard for the well-being of its owner. The owner tolerates the bird not out of affection, but because it's generally more profitable for him than getting rid of the annoying neighbor. And yet, despite all this ambiguity, one thing is certain: their paths are inextricably intertwined. For thousands upon thousands of years, the buffalo hasn't woken up alone at dawn on the savanna. Next to him, on his warm hide, a small red-billed bird settles in, ready to clean his skin or reopen an old wound, as the situation dictates. The giant endures. The little one profits. And together, they continue a story that began long before us and, by all appearances, shows no sign of ending. So what exactly is an oxpecker? A loyal guardian of the savanna, or a cunning parasite masquerading as a friend? Perhaps there's simply no definitive answer. Or perhaps, after watching this episode, you think otherwise. If you found this amazing bird's life story interesting, please give it a like. It really helps the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss other stories about unexpected unions in the wild. And be sure to let me know in the comments, what do you think the oxpecker is to the buffalo? A hero, a parasite, or something more interesting than both?